So we're going to get things underway. Welcome to NCHE's virtual conference breakout session entitled Lost Worlds, Vanished Times, Why Study History with our presenter, Peter Gibbon. Before we turn the floor over to Peter, NCHE would like to recognize the various support from sponsors for this virtual conference that have made this process possible. Again, many of us, if not all of us, were anticipating sitting in a room together, seeing one another in Cleveland, and we appreciate the quick transitions from both our presenters as well as our participants in transitioning to this virtual environment, and certainly to our partners here that have sponsored the event. And again, we're very appreciative of that. In particular, we'd like to thank the National Humanities Center for its partnership in the virtual conference and the GoToWebinar for the licensing support. The NHC has a wide catalog of online and in-person opportunities for scholars and educators to collaborate. Please visit their website, and you can see that here. We'll also have that available in a variety of different formats. We encourage you to download the conference app which has the most up-to-date information about the conference, and take time to visit the virtual exhibit hall. We're trying to make this as similar to what you would have experienced in Cleveland. You'll find wonderful opportunities there for resources and connections. My name is Christy Bruger. I am a professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I am also the chair of the NCHE board, and I'll be moderating this session. You may use the chat function to type your questions or comments during the session, and at intermittent points, I'll share those with Peter as he's presenting. So please don't hesitate to do that. And then following the session, please take a minute to complete our survey. In addition to providing the valuable feedback that our participants always do, completing the survey puts you into a daily drawing for one of our special door prizes, and we've got those displayed at the end. So with all of that business attended to, it's my pleasure to turn the session over to Peter Gibbon for Lost Worlds, Vanished Time, and Why Study History.
Christy, thank you so much for facilitating the session, and welcome to all the attendees. I thought I'd talk just a little bit about how I got interested in this subject before we turn to the PowerPoint. So I taught history for many years, both at public and private schools. And I always felt that there was too much just plunging into the subject and not enough analysis of why history was important. Sometimes social studies and history is considered to be kids' least favorite subject. And I think one reason is they don't know why they're studying it. So I created this PowerPoint when I started doing Teaching American History. Some of you out there may remember that Teaching American History went on for 7 or 8 years. I did 5 or 6 of those sessions. And I actually created this PowerPoint in order to introduce the teachers to history, and then they could take the PowerPoint back to their classes. I would recommend using the PowerPoint not straight in 1 week, the way we're going to run through it quickly now. I mean, you could use it 2 days here, 2 days there. You could, when you come to Thomas Jefferson, you could go back to the Jefferson section. You'll notice I do have a section on disease. Appropriate now, you could go to that section when you thought appropriate, or you could just plunge into your American history course and then do this after 2 or 3 weeks. But it's up to you how you think best to use it. After leaving history, I went to Harvard and I did a book on heroism. Then I went to Boston University, where I am now, and that's where I actually created this PowerPoint. So I'm going to run through the PowerPoint very quickly. I think there are 80 slides. I'm going to start at certain slides, and I'm going to pause after each section. I think there are 4 colors, and then we could pause and stop for some reaction or questions. Okay? So, of course, history is the memory of things said or done. we don't know exactly what happened in history. Let me just see if I can advance it here.
I'm going to go ahead and do that for you.
Oh, okay. Are you going to advance, Christy?
I will, yes. So please
Okay.
just give me the.
Okay, so these are all kinds of primary sources in written documents. Next. I give some examples. It's going back, wait, slow down here. This is, can we go back, Christy, just to the beginning?
Certainly.
Right there. Okay, so there's a famous diary, and many of you know it was made into a book, A Midwife's Tale. So you can actually give kids a sense of what a diary actually looks like. Next. Common sense, you all know, remind the students that that was a very powerful primary source, sold 120,000 copies. Next.
You can control it. You can't.
A good letter from Abigail Adams. For each of these slides, you could talk for 15 or 20 minutes. This is, of course, the famous Remember the Ladies that Abigail wrote to her husband. Next, please. Jefferson's draft, when you're doing the Declaration of Independence, you can show the students the actual Jefferson writing and also remind them of this famous controversy where Jefferson said that King George was responsible for bringing slaves to America. It was, of course, deleted. So I think you can remind kids that the Declaration didn't just suddenly magically appear. Next, please. Ben Franklin's autobiography. Now notice I said that this is the reason he gave for history. We have a real debate in American history now whether we should show students reality or we should show them some kind of idealized history. My own personal opinion is that we have gone too far in the Howard Zinn direction and showed them that American history is all about conflict and failure. And here it's interesting that Franklin, 3 centuries ago, thought the purpose of history was to fix in the minds of youth beauty and the usefulness of virtue. So a very different look at history and one we might consider. Next, please. So history, of course, includes not only written sources, but artifacts. Next. I take my TH students to Poplar Forest, and we actually see the historians doing digging and coming up with these artifacts. And so you can remind your kids that you can learn from artifacts as well as primary sources. Next. Something that survived. This cradle is in Plymouth. I used to live in Plymouth. Next. You could talk for 15 minutes about the importance of the fur trade. Jefferson's plow. Okay, fine. Next, please. Jefferson actually created this plow. Among his many acts of genius was to create a plow through mathematics that was more efficient. Next, please. Spinning frame, the Industrial Revolution. So here we see Samuel Slater's English model. Next, please. You all know the importance of the cotton gin, but it's good for the kids to actually see it as you describe what the gin did and why it transformed American history. Next, please. So in addition to artifacts, we have engravings. Next. Bunker Hill, next. Famous cartoon where Jefferson is supposedly destroying the Constitution according to his enemy. Next. Sculptures. You know, you can pause a minute and ask the kids, what do they see in the faces of these two famous Americans? I look at Ben Franklin, I see humor. I see serenity, I see wisdom. But it's an interesting exercise to actually look at works of art and ask the kids to respond. Next, please. This is all well known, the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. You can talk about Robert Gould Shaw and how he went from being a Harvard student to being a famous leader of the African American Regiment. Next. This is kind of interesting. This is a greenhouse statue of George Washington, was actually considered sort of racy and even obscene by some people because they showed him from the waist up. And they actually removed it from the museum and put it outside as a result of that. It's now back in the Smithsonian. I don't think kids find it so upsetting anymore. Notice wearing the hats. You can talk about that. Notice the dress of the kids in the 1870s, I think, when this was taken. Next. Winslow Homer, the famous American painter. Sharpshooters were condemned by both sides as being sort of an unfair form of warfare. Next. Another Homer, the end of the war, peace, the veteran in a new field. Again, you can ask kids to respond. What do they see in this picture? Why is it important? How does it close the Civil War? Next. I like this. Since I'm a school teacher, Homer cracked the whip that kids played. Notice the lack of shoes you could point out. You could point out that, of course, you have a female teacher. At this point, it was an all-male profession in the 1830s. By the 1870s, it's starting to become a predominantly female profession. Next, please. This photograph was very upsetting when it was first displayed. For the first time, Americans got a sense of the casualties of the Civil War. The photographer, of course, Matthew Brady. Next. The next section is the limitations of historical knowledge. Kids sort of think that, you know, we know all history, or that they need to know the problems with historical knowledge. Next. Martha Washington destroyed all her personal correspondence with her husband. Next.
Before we go on, I'm going to ask a question if it's okay. Why did she destroy all of that correspondence?
Well, it's a good question. Martha Washington was a very private person. By the time her husband had died, she had already become obsessed with the criticisms that were made of her. The prying press. The press for the first time was invading the lives of presidents and senators. And Martha Washington didn't want anything less. She wasn't thinking of kids in 2020. She wasn't thinking of historians. She was thinking of sort of the image she wanted to convey. And so it will always be a mystery as to what she was hiding. I tend to think there's no great smoking gun, but people are still very protective. For example, Jackie Kennedy's papers aren't available again for 20 or 30 years. So today you can put your documents in libraries and say, wait, you can't pry and look at my private life until 20 or 30 years after I died. Thanks, Christy, good question.
Yeah.
Next.
And again, if any of the participants, if you've got questions, please don't hesitate to use that chat function.
Here's another good answer to Christy's question. Richmond was destroyed. We do not have the kinds of documents for the Confederate side that we would like because the library at Richmond was destroyed. Next. We don't even know what Columbus looked like. These are fanciful portraits, but Columbus never sat for his portrait. I think that would amaze kids. Next. We also have bias. In addition to not having enough sources, we have bias. Next. The first account of America, of Plymouth Plantation, was written by the governor. It wasn't written by the workers or the women or the servants. So there's a bias toward the wealthy and the powerful as far as recording our past. And notice, of course, the religious bias, the Lord is the help of my life. So, of course, on Plymouth Plantation is very much from a strongly religious point of view. Next, please. What remains? This is a working class house in the capital city. This is the James Todd House, very prominent resident. And of course, the working class houses have disappeared. Next. So there's a bias towards the literate and articulate, men more than women, mill owners more than workers. You could spend a lot of time talking to kids about this slide. Yeah, next, thanks, Christine. Yeah, the Great Hall. This is from Jefferson, masters more than slaves. We do, of course, have some slave documents. We have some diaries. We have Frederick Douglass's account of his time when he was a slave, but not nearly as many as we would like. Here's what's all that's left of Mulberry Row, the slave houses. Next. Sally Hemings, you all know, Jefferson's alleged mistress. The majority of historians believed that that was so. There are a few that say the DNA evidence is not absolute. But what do we know about Sally Hemings? One little line in Jefferson's farm book. Jefferson methodically kept records, and there, the woman that he had children with, perhaps, probably loved, remains. Next. There's a bias towards conflict. Comminger and Tuckman, both famous historians, say that there's an overload of the negative.
I'm going to ask one more question if I can. Again, I was excited to come to this session regardless of moderation. I'm curious about the relationship between authorship and bias and how we might think about that with our students.
Well, it's a good question. I think I'm going to talk in a minute about subjectivity, but an example would be, well, let's move a couple of slides and I'm going to pick up on that question.
Okay, sounds good. I'll move forward to this. Here we go.
Yeah. I'm coming back to Christie's question, but I think Tacitus made this famous statement that the purpose of history is to rescue virtuous actions from oblivion. There's a bias in the historical record towards conflict. And so I say, remember the normal and the good. The most famous hero of all times, according to Thomas Jefferson, was Edward Jenner. He said we shouldn't remember generals. We shouldn't remember great philosophers. We should remember the man who eliminated this scourge of a disease. Next. Will Durant's famous, "Who will dare to write a history of human goodness?" Next. Getting back to Christie's question, history is a subjective discipline, and all people bring their own personal feelings and their views toward it. And I'll pick up on that a little bit more as we go through the next section. Okay, the next. So today we have, instead of history used to be political history, history from Washington, history from the top. And now it includes all of these: religion, climate, of course, now illness and disease, demography, ecology. We call this total history. Next. Well, I don't know how long you want to linger on this, but this is incredibly relevant to remind all of you and to remind your students that, say, yellow fever killed 10% of Philadelphia's population. In a way, that's consolation. No physician, no doctor is predicting any kind of casualties like that. But smallpox, one of Washington's greatest achievements was to inoculate his troops. And of course, the whole of Native American history was determined by the spread of disease. You need to remind your students that Americans were not exactly generous or kind in their creation of Native Americans, but of course 90 to 95% of the casualties were caused by diseases for which they had no protection. Next. Those are the estimated losses of Unions, Confederates, and again, 60%. You notice diseases make up the disproportionate number of battle deaths. That didn't change until World War I. Next. Again, a quite relevant slide. There's both terror and hope in this slide. The influenza in October killed hundreds of thousands of people in October 1918. It came out of the blue. People didn't social distance the way we're doing. Philadelphia was doing bond drives in the middle of the epidemic. Troops were being sent on troop ships to turn back the Germans. Woodrow Wilson had to make an agonizing decision. He knew that the flu could spread, but he thought the Germans were the greater disease. Now I say that the good news was that by December, it had almost completely disappeared. Some say it just blew through all Americans, killing everyone it could. Others say, don't know why it disappeared. So we hope when we're meeting again in May, the same thing will have happened with the coronavirus. Next, please. So we now talk about more than just presidents, congressmen. History now includes a wider cast of characters. Next. Women, African Americans, the Irish. From the potato famine, there are these Irish memorials all over America. Next. The monument to Lakota warrior Chief Crazy Horse is still being built as we speak today. Next. I'm slowly getting to Christie's question here. The next section, why is the study of history subjective and not a science? Next. Okay, so this is getting to her answer. Look at the bottom quote. We read history through our prejudices. All of us have certain attitudes towards life, and we don't just look at the past objectively. Some of us are very privileged, and we look at the past through elitist lenses. If you're African American, you look at history through different lenses. If you're a woman in a patriarchal society, at least what's been a patriarchal society, you look at history through a different lens. So I think this quote by Beard is particularly appropriate. The historian seeking to know the past does not bring to the partial documentation. So your kids can spend a lot of time in this quote. Notice partial documentation with which he works a polished and neutral mind. Just a plug for an article I wrote. I did an article in Humanities Magazine on the battle for history, which you can find easily just looking under NEH. And I think it deals with this question, the battle over history and why we don't have polished, neutral minds. Next. In addition to having prejudices, The times change and our values change. There Columbus on the left is standing tall and proud. Today, schools are debating whether even to celebrate Columbus Day. In 1893, this statue was at the center of the Columbian Exposition. On the right, we see Columbus Day. The genocide of the New World began. Next. Okay, so in the Depression, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., one of our great historians, depicted Andrew Jackson as a brave soldier. Now he is associated with a trail of tears. He's associated with many duels. He's associated with slavery. It's interesting that not all people agree. The President of the United States has put Andrew Jackson's picture in his office because he believes that Jackson was pugnacious, courageous, took no prisoners. It's clearly a message that Donald Trump wanted to send about his values. Next. By the way, there's a very good, on Amazon Prime, you can get a 5-part series on the Trail of Tears. I just watched it recently. It's very well done. So that's how Andrew Burstein portrays Jackson. Next. Okay, now we're getting to sort of the heart of the presentation, and that is why study history. Just reminding you, we've looked at the way history has changed, sort of the new social history. We've looked at the fact that history is mostly a catalog of war and horrors instead of the normal and good. And now we're going to get some reasons why students should spend a year studying history. Okay, next please. It's a little bit like taking paregoric. You do have to know facts because facts precede deep thinking and critical inquiry. So you can't have a fact-free presentation of history. And that's true with every discipline, and it's true with history. Next. So just taking the American Revolution, you have to be able to identify those events, and you have to be able to put them in the right order in order to have a discussion. Next. There, I think I have them in the right order. Next. But then we can start to ask the interesting questions once we have that material. How did the 7 Years' War lead to the Stamp Act? How did the Boston Tea Party provoke a crisis? But only with some information can we do, quote, critical thinking. Everyone says critical thinking is the goal of history and of education in general, but we need to constantly remind our students that you can't have a fact-free critical thinking. Next,
What
please.
strikes me about these questions you've displayed is that there's a seemingly simple quote unquote answer that students could present, and there's certainly some very deep thinking that could be unpacked with each one of these things.
Yeah, good point, Christy. Just on how did America win the war, you could spend a full day on the last question. You could talk about propaganda. You could talk about the British getting tired. You could talk about the genius of George Washington. You could talk about loyalists disappearing. You could talk about Native Americans. So there are many, you're right, to unpack each of these. And of course, you can say that some historians spend their entire lives. Question number one, there's a famous historian named Henry Gibbon who did a 10-volume famous collection of books on how did the French and Indian War lead to the Stamp Act, just studying the British imperial system. Good point. Next. Now, here's something I really believe in. I'm conducting, assuming life goes along normally, a National Endowment seminar on biography and American history. My pet peeve is that we do not spend enough time on the personal. That really is what gets kids interested. If you ask the average American adult why he or she got interested in history, they almost always say a biography. And that's natural. We're social creatures. We're interested in other people. But in our rush to get through American history, we leave out anecdotes and personality and biography. So here I just throw out 6. What propelled Cotton Mather? He wanted to keep up with his father. Ben Franklin moved to Philadelphia after fighting with his brother. Ben Franklin had an amazing correspondence with his sister who couldn't write. And Jill Lepore is going to speak later, and her textbook is fantastic. But to me, her greatest book is a book describing the relationship between Ben and Jane. One had to get married at 15, had a large family, never really got educated. Ben, a male, flew to Philadelphia. Of course, he was a genius after fighting with his brother. Thomas Jefferson never would have gone to France if his wife hadn't died. And you could talk a lot about how lucky we are today. We are going through a grieving period, a time of horrors in America now. But compared with Thomas Jefferson's time, with the omnipresence of death, it's nothing like what we have today. So Jefferson, just to refresh your memory, had his children, and it was very common for women to die either in childbirth or shortly thereafter, and she just got worn out with miscarriages and giving children. John and Abigail Adams had a great marriage, but not a perfect life. They had an alcoholic son. Abraham Lincoln only slowly got to marry Mary Todd. Maybe he regretted it. They had a very tumultuous marriage. You could talk about the Lincoln-Mary Todd marriage and their son's death and how that influenced the Civil War. So I say we need to reach out to our ancestors and discover our common humanity. I'm very interested, even though it's a little bit gossipy and intrusive and voyeuristic, but it's important to see how private life influences public policy. And I just talked about Thomas Jefferson, but for the rest of his life, he kept this phrase from Tristan Shandy and wrapped it around a lock of Martha's hair. People would keep bits of hair in glass cases to remember the deceased. Next. Alexander Hamilton had a sex scandal. We're not going into all the gory details, but to interest your students, you might tell him that he tried to be openly honest about his adultery and resulted in a scandal, an 80-page defense, and ruining his chances to become president. Next. Well, Franklin Roosevelt never would have become the man he was without polio. So you could talk to your students about how polio made Roosevelt more compassionate. You could talk to them about the way we hid illnesses. It was forbidden. This is a rare photograph to see Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair. Photographers had their cameras confiscated and their film destroyed if they photographed that. But in fact, he was once tall, handsome, vigorous, and athletic until being felled by this mysterious disease. And it's a story of great courage. We forget what it took for him every day to get dressed and to be cheerful and ebullient. And I know Eleanor Roosevelt felt that the disease transformed his personality. Next.
It makes me think about the previous slides and showing some of those sculptures and thinking about how he is commemorated and how the wheelchair is both evident but hidden in the Washington memorial to him, as well as you were talking about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Christy, because today we are more honest and open and realistic, maybe voyeuristic about our presidents. And so today in the memorial, you're right, we do recognize that he was in a wheelchair. Well, I'm a big believer in everyday life. In addition to fixating on biography, my other sort of cause is everyday life. And I just run through some of the things that were common in the 17th century. No city. I'm in a very comfortable New Haven apartment, 70 degrees. I had 2 kids. My parents had 6. I have my own private office. Privacy was rare. I go to the gym every day because I need physical labor. Then physical labor was constant. They wanted to sit down. Physical discomfort was normal. I have some of the afflictions of old age, high blood pressure, diabetes, but nothing compared with a time when the average lifespan was maybe 40 years old and at least 3 out of 5 children would die from disease before getting to 5. So the lifespan was shorter, death was routine. I also look at fundamental beliefs. It's hard to believe. George Washington had bloodletting. That's why he died, probably. We had slavery and servants. We had fixed social classes. The Bible was the center of education. All kids took Latin and Greek, and private education was the norm, not public. So these are all, I think what interests kids the way life is so different. Next. That's the Lost Worlds and Vanished Times, by the way. Another reason, remember the subject that we're now discussing is why we study history. And one of the main reasons is to recognize that our ancestors were future blind as we are. I wish I could predict what America will be like in 1 month or in 3 months. I wish I could say that the stock market would go up and the virus would disappear. We don't know. It's very hard to predict. And I have some examples of things that you never would have thought of. Slavery dying a natural death, they thought. One of the few laws of history I mentioned in my humanity article is that wars are always short. World War I, the troops would be home by Christmas. That was believed in Germany and in England. Who could imagine the Holocaust? I grew up during the Vietnam War, and we were told repeatedly that the North Vietnamese were about to give up. Who would have believed that they would fight so long and so hard? So a lesson of history. Next, please. History is not inevitable. We have to understand that we might have banned slavery. It would have been nice and saved 1 million lives if Hitler had been assassinated in 1944. So the way things turned out is not inevitable. Next. Chance and accident. Fog allowed Washington to escape Manhattan. I just mentioned Hitler and the bomb was accidentally moved. So he was slightly wounded, but not killed. Next, please. I think our history, the way it is taught today, is too grim and gloomy. I think it's a Howard Zinn version, which not only is not accurate, but is not healthy for young people. I really believe that young people, it's actually written into state constitutions that the purpose of education is to encourage virtue and some optimism. I think that's disappeared. So I like to remind students of some of the great things that have happened in American history. American history ether was discovered, instant communications with a telegraph, the heart of the public school movement actually was in America. So we should be appreciative of progress and grateful to our ancestors. Next. I would describe it as what I would call an informed patriotism. I'm not a believer in chauvinism. I'm not a believer in exceptionalism. I'm not a believer in triumphalism, but I do believe that students should not leave their high school history classroom feeling that America is a failure, a cheat, and a disappointment. Prudence Crandall, this is an unknown event, but I live in Connecticut, and here she is now the state hero. And okay, here's every state has a state hero, but the students in a middle school in Connecticut felt that that was unfair, that Connecticut need a hero, and they campaigned for Prudence Crandall, who was a fighter for emancipation. And she is now honored in the State House as the official heroine of Connecticut. What she did actually is there was a movement to expel the Negroes that were being educated in the seminary, and she insisted that they stay. Next, please. Dorothea Dix. My hero book actually starts out with heroines, and here she is the one to remove the mentally ill from prisons. Next. Andrew Carnegie is often thought of only as an industrialist and even a robber baron. But one of his famous quotes is, "The man who dies rich dies disgraced." He's the foundation of philanthropy. He's a creator of libraries throughout America. Just an interesting anecdote. I go to Maine and I shop at LL Beans, and there's a store right across from LL Beans, which I think is Patagonia. I can't remember the store, but it's a former Carnegie Library, but they've transformed into a clothing store. So I always go in there and I tell the salespeople, not that they're always interested, about the history of Andrew Carnegie and how the library that they are now selling T-shirts in was once a library and was free. And so that's my little, as a teacher and historian, I can never be quiet. Next. I think Longfellow should be taught in schools. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. So one of the purposes of history is to introduce us to greatness. Next. When I wrote my book on heroes, I used to take trips up to the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. It's now in a uptown in the Bronx, not an easy neighborhood to walk through, but I made many pilgrimages to this to get inspiration for my book. And people would pick who was the great American for the year, and they would create a statue, and these statues still remain in the Hall of Fame for Great Americans. So when you look up at Mount Rushmore, next. I have some quotes trying to nail down this idea. Emerson is not always taught. With the great, our thoughts and manners easily become great. And Aristotle, from noble men, you may learn noble deeds. So I believe in role models. I believe in imitation. I believe in turning to history for inspiration. And as I said at the beginning, I think biography is very important. And I think we make a mistake as a society, a culture, and a country about fixating on the evils of America. America is not perfect, of course. We have the great sin of slavery. We've had our wars. We've had our prejudices. But compared with other nations, I think America is exceptional. Next. So this was the most famous historian of the 19th century. A very different view of history, a didactic function, a moral mission, an inspirational value. Next. Well, I'm in a project where we're trying to bring back civics into schools, and we need to remember the words of the preamble. Next. You
And
can't
just
have,
so you know, we've just got about 3 minutes.
okay, we can't have civics without history. We're going to go through. Next. To appreciate freedom, we need reconstruction. To appreciate the blessings of freedom, we should be familiar with World War II. Continue. Continue. History encourages an informed patriotism. Continue. Now, the final point, it helps us to understand the present. The debate over affirmative action is related to slavery. Social security is tied to memories of the Great Depression. Very important. Next. And to learn from past mistakes. The Japanese internment we know is wrong. We try to do better. Next. Next. And finally, summarizing. Facts, chronology, causes, current events in the context of the past, understanding our ancestors were future blind. So it's useful. It's actually useful. Next. It's interesting. I finished with kind of bicycles. And finally, elevating. Gratitude, appreciation of progress, and an introduction to greatness. Christy, thank you for the questions. If anyone wants the PowerPoint, Christy, I think we have ways of sending it to them.
Yes, and I would just wanted to confirm that with your registration, I'm going to go ahead this afternoon and kick out this PowerPoint, if it's okay with you. To our participants, I want to say thank you, Peter, for your time, your work, and insight this morning. Thank you to our participants, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, participants, for coming, and thank you, Christy, for facilitating.
No problem. And thank you, Carol, who I think was there the whole time too.
Exactly. Very grateful to my wife for everything.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.